Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in the heart of West Africa, scarred by decades of poverty, plagued by violent extremism, and overshadowed by the long shadow of French colonial influence. For years, the people lived in uncertainty. Terrorist attacks by groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS devastated villages. Families abandoned their homes, farmers left their lands, and the nation's very survival seemed to hang by a thread. The international community labeled Burkina Faso a fragile state. Aid poured in, but the crises never ended. Corruption, weak governance, and dependency on foreign powers deepened the wounds. And then, from the ranks of the military, an unfamiliar name suddenly emerged. A young captain, barely 34 years old, seized power in a dramatic coup. His name? Ibrahim Traoré. When his face first appeared on television screens, many outside Burkina Faso were stunned. "Who is this young soldier?" journalists asked. "Can someone so young really lead a nation?" But inside the country, something different was happening. Crowds filled the streets. Supporters waved flags. Songs of resistance echoed in the air. For the first time in years, people dared to dream again. Why? Because Traoré represented something more than just another soldier with a gun. He embodied a new chapter in Africa's long fight for dignity, independence, and self-determination. Burkina Faso, after all, has a proud history of revolutionary spirit. It was here that Thomas Sankara, the African Che Guevara, once led with fiery speeches about freedom, equality, and the rejection of neo-colonialism. Sankara's assassination in 1987 left scars that never fully healed, but his memory lived on in the hearts of millions. So when Traoré stepped forward, many saw in him the rebirth of Sankara's legacy, a chance to finish the mission that was brutally cut short decades ago. Yet, the world remains divided. To some, he is a patriot, a visionary, a man who dares to challenge the old order. To others, he is a dangerous populist, an untested soldier who risks dragging Burkina Faso into deeper chaos. But one thing is certain: the rise of Ibrahim Traoré has become one of the most remarkable political stories in Africa today. This is the story of how a young soldier from a modest background rose to power, challenged the global order, and captured the imagination of millions across the continent. A story of courage, controversy, and the uncertain future of a nation at the crossroads. This is not just about Burkina Faso. This is about Africa, about freedom, and about the question every African generation must face: who will lead the struggle for true independence? To understand who Ibrahim Traoré is today, we must first go back to a childhood lived far away from the luxury of presidential palaces, far from wealth or privilege. Ibrahim Traoré was born in 1988 in the western town of Bondokouy, a modest community in Burkina Faso. He grew up like millions of other Burkinabe children, surrounded by hardship, but also by resilience. The son of ordinary parents, Traoré was no stranger to the struggles of daily survival. He saw firsthand how farmers worked tirelessly under the burning African sun, only to be trapped in poverty year after year. He saw how corruption and weak leadership failed the people time and again. But even in this environment, a quiet determination grew inside him. Teachers and classmates often described him as disciplined, sharp, and reserved, a young man who spoke little but thought deeply. Education was his first path forward. Traoré attended local schools, later pursuing higher education in geology at the University of Ouagadougou. Yes, before he was a soldier, he was a student of science. He dreamed at one point of working in natural resources, exploring the rich lands of his country. But destiny had other plans. The instability of Burkina Faso was impossible to ignore. Terrorist groups were spreading across West Africa. Villages were under attack. Soldiers were dying. Ordinary people were left defenseless. Like many young men of his generation, Traoré felt the call of service. He entered the Burkinabe army, trading books for boots, geology for the gun. His military training was rigorous, pushing him to his limits both physically and mentally. Colleagues remember him as a focused, no-nonsense officer. Not the loudest, not the most ambitious outwardly, but someone who could be relied upon in the most difficult of missions. And difficult they were. Traoré was deployed to some of the most dangerous front lines in Burkina Faso, where extremist groups carried out relentless assaults on villages and security posts. He witnessed the suffering of his people not from a distance, but up close. He marched with soldiers who had little food, outdated weapons, and no support from the government they served. These years changed him. He began to see that the fight against terrorism was not just a military struggle. It was political. It was about leadership, about vision, about who truly cared for the people. In 2014, Burkina Faso experienced an uprising that toppled President Blaise Compaoré, who had ruled for 27 years. The event shook the nation, and young officers like Traoré took note. The people wanted change, and they were willing to fight for it. Traoré continued to rise quietly in the army's ranks, eventually achieving the position of artillery captain. Unlike many officers, he stayed close to his men. Soldiers under his command often spoke of how he shared their food, marched with them in the heat, and never acted above them. This bond would later prove crucial, because in Burkina Faso, coups are never just about politics at the top. They are about who the soldiers on the ground trust. And in Ibrahim Traoré, they found a leader they respected, a man who understood their pain, a man who, like them, had bled, sweated, and risked his life for the survival of the nation. Little by little, the young captain was no longer just a soldier. He was becoming something far greater, a symbol of hope. By 2022, Burkina Faso was reaching its breaking point. The government, led by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Damiba, himself a product of a coup just months earlier, had promised security and reform. But instead, the violence worsened. Entire towns fell under the control of extremist groups. Farmers could not work their fields. Markets stood empty. Families fled their homes by the hundreds of thousands. Confidence in the government evaporated. And among the soldiers on the front lines, the anger was even greater. They were tired of fighting with poor equipment, tired of watching comrades die while politicians lived in comfort. Whispers began to circulate in the barracks. Something had to change. In September 2022, the whispers became action. A group of soldiers, frustrated with Damiba's failures, rallied around a new figure, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. It was a bold and dangerous move. At just 34 years old, Traoré was not the obvious choice. He had no powerful family name, no long political history, no foreign backers. What he had was something different: the trust of the rank-and-file soldiers. On the morning of September 30th, 2022, gunfire echoed in the capital city of Ouagadougou. Military vehicles rolled through the streets. Soldiers set up roadblocks. The people watched in silence, waiting to see what would unfold. By nightfall, it was clear. The Damiba government had fallen. On national television, a young officer in camouflage appeared, his voice calm, his words sharp. He announced that the government had been dissolved, the constitution suspended, and a new path was beginning. That officer was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. To many outside observers, it seemed almost surreal. How could a young captain, barely known to the world, suddenly seize control of a nation in crisis? But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was not just about military power. It was about a leader who reflected their anger, their exhaustion, and their longing for dignity. Crowds poured into the streets, not in protest, but in celebration. They waved the national flag. They carried portraits of Thomas Sankara, linking Traoré instantly to the legendary revolutionary of the 1980s. The chants were clear. Burkina Faso had found a new defender. Still, Traoré's rise was not without controversy. Damiba initially refused to step down, sparking tense negotiations. For days, the capital was on edge. But eventually, Damiba fled into exile, and Traoré consolidated his grip on power. And so, at just 34 years old, Ibrahim Traoré became the youngest head of state in the world. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. At a time when much of Africa is ruled by aging elites clinging to power, here was a leader young enough to represent the new generation. But with power came expectations and dangers. International headlines exploded. Burkina Faso's surprise leader, the world's youngest president. A revolution in West Africa. But behind the headlines was a harsher reality. Burkina Faso was still at war. The economy was crumbling. Millions of people were displaced, hungry, and desperate. And the international community, especially former colonial power France, was watching closely. Yet Traoré wasted no time in signaling his intentions. He declared that the old ways had failed, that Burkina Faso would chart a new course, one free from dependency, one that put the people first. The coup of September 2022 was not just a transfer of power, it was a declaration, a message to the world that a new chapter was being written. For some, Traoré was a savior. For others, a dangerous populist whose youth and inexperience could prove catastrophic. But one thing was clear: Burkina Faso had entered a new era, and its future now rested on the shoulders of the young captain who dared to defy the old order. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré took power, he inherited a nation on the edge of collapse. The people demanded change, the soldiers demanded results, the world demanded answers. And almost immediately, Traoré began to chart a bold, controversial path: the war at home. His first priority was clear: the fight against terrorism. For years, extremists had terrorized villages, killing civilians, burning homes, and planting fear across the countryside. Previous governments relied heavily on foreign aid and French military support, but the results were disastrous. Attacks only increased, and Burkina Faso's sovereignty weakened. Traoré rejected this dependency. He called on ordinary citizens to join in defending their communities. He announced the recruitment of 50,000 civilian volunteers, known as the Volunteers for the Defense of the Fatherland. These men and women, often poorly equipped but highly motivated, became the backbone of his new security strategy. For Traoré, this was more than military reform. It was symbolic. He was telling the people, the defense of Burkina Faso will be done by Burkinabe hands, not by foreign powers. But this came at a cost. The humanitarian crisis worsened. Villages were caught in crossfire, and accusations of abuses by volunteer fighters spread. International organizations raised alarms. Yet many inside Burkina Faso insisted it was a necessary sacrifice for survival. Breaking with France. Perhaps Traoré's boldest move came in his confrontation with France, the former colonial power. For decades, Burkina Faso, like many West African nations, had remained tied to Paris through military, economic, and cultural dependence. French troops were stationed on Burkinabe soil, promising security but delivering little. Traoré changed everything. He ordered French forces to leave. He ended military agreements that tied his nation's hands. He closed down French media outlets accused of manipulation. It was a stunning reversal of decades of policy. In the eyes of many Africans, it was a long-awaited act of defiance. To them, Traoré was standing up not only for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. Crowds in Ouagadougou celebrated, waving Russian flags alongside Burkinabe banners, chanting anti-French slogans. But in Paris and Washington, alarm bells rang. Analysts warned that Burkina Faso was turning away from the West into the arms of new global powers. Turning to new allies indeed, as French influence waned, Traoré sought new partnerships. He strengthened ties with Mali and Guinea, two neighboring nations also ruled by young military leaders after coups. Together, they formed the Alliance of Sahel States, pledging mutual defense and cooperation. Beyond Africa, Traoré looked to Russia, whose presence in Africa has been growing rapidly. Moscow offered weapons, training, and political support, filling the void left by France. To some, this was strategic genius. To others, it was a dangerous gamble that could entangle Burkina Faso in a new kind of dependency. Economic and social reforms beyond security, Traoré promised reforms in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. He spoke of a Burkina Faso that could stand on its own feet, using its resources for its own people. But promises were easier than reality. With more than 2 million people displaced, the economy shrinking, and global sanctions limiting aid, progress was painfully slow. Still, his speeches ignited hope. He dressed simply, refused luxury cars, and lived with the air of a soldier rather than a politician. For a population tired of corrupt elites, this authenticity mattered. The world reacts. Internationally, reactions were mixed. The United Nations warned of growing instability. ECOWAS, the regional bloc, criticized the coup but stopped short of harsh sanctions. The United States expressed concern but kept lines of communication open. France, however, was openly hostile. Media outlets painted Traoré as reckless, inexperienced, and under the influence of Russia. But across much of Africa, the opposite narrative took hold. Social media exploded with images of Traoré alongside Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah. Hashtags celebrated him as the face of Africa's second independence. And so, in less than a year, Ibrahim Traoré transformed from an unknown captain into one of the most polarizing figures in African politics. Loved by many, hated by others. A symbol of resistance, but also a leader under immense pressure. The question was no longer, who is Ibrahim Traoré? It became, can he survive the storm he has unleashed? When Ibrahim Traoré first appeared on television, many outside observers saw just another military officer. But for millions across Africa, his image carried far greater weight. Why? Because Africa has seen this story before. The shadow of Thomas Sankara. In the 1980s, Burkina Faso was home to one of Africa's most iconic leaders, Thomas Sankara. Young, charismatic, and fiercely anti-imperialist, Sankara transformed the country in just 4 short years. He changed its name from Upper Volta to Burkina Faso, the land of upright people. He promoted women's rights, banned luxury cars for officials, launched vaccination campaigns, and declared war on corruption. But perhaps most importantly, Sankara challenged the global order. He rejected aid dependency, criticized the International Monetary Fund, and called for African unity against neo-colonialism. For this, he was loved by the people, but feared by the powerful. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup widely believed to have foreign backing. His death left a wound in the African conscience. For decades, leaders who followed rarely dared to embrace his revolutionary spirit. Until now. When Traoré speaks of sovereignty, when he wears simple military fatigues, when he rejects France's control, Africans see Sankara reborn. It is no coincidence that his supporters carry Sankara's portrait alongside his own. Other ghosts of the past. But Sankara is not the only name invoked. In Congo, there was Patrice Lumumba, the young prime minister who spoke fiercely against Belgian exploitation, only to be assassinated in 1961. In Ghana, there was Kwame Nkrumah, who led his country to independence and dreamed of a United States of Africa. Across the continent, these figures shared a common fate: bold vision, foreign hostility, and often tragic ends. So when Ibrahim Traoré rises, people see him in that same lineage. A young man daring to resist the old order, knowing the risks, yet pressing forward. The struggle beyond borders. Traoré's symbolism extends beyond Burkina Faso. In Mali, Guinea, Niger, and across the Sahel, people see him as proof that Africa's younger generation is no longer willing to be silent. Protests in favor of Traoré have erupted in cities outside Burkina Faso. His speeches are translated and shared across social media, reaching millions of Africans hungry for change. To them, he is not just a captain or even a president. He is a mirror of their own frustrations. Frustrations with poverty despite abundant natural resources. Frustrations with leaders who enrich themselves while the people starve. Frustrations with foreign powers who continue to exploit Africa under the name of partnership. A dangerous symbol. But being a symbol is a double-edged sword. Symbols inspire hope, but they also invite enemies. Traoré knows the history of Sankara and Lumumba. He knows that standing against powerful global interests is dangerous. Already, whispers of assassination plots circulate. Analysts question whether his government can withstand the military and economic pressures being placed on it. And yet, he continues forward, refusing to bow. For many Africans, Ibrahim Traoré is not simply the president of Burkina Faso. He is the face of a much larger struggle, the struggle for Africa's dignity, independence, and future. Whether he succeeds or fails, his image has already ignited something that cannot easily be extinguished. The belief that a new generation of African leaders is rising, willing to fight for sovereignty at any cost. And so, the story of Ibrahim Traoré is still being written. From a small town in western Burkina Faso, to the front lines of a war against extremism, to the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, his journey is nothing short of extraordinary. But the question remains, what comes next? For his people, Traoré is not just a leader. He is a symbol of survival, hope, and resistance. But symbols carry heavy burdens. Burkina Faso is still one of the poorest countries in the world. Millions remain displaced by conflict. The economy struggles to breathe under sanctions and instability. Traoré must deliver more than fiery speeches. He must provide food, jobs, security, and dignity. And that task, as history has shown, may prove harder than taking power itself. At home, he faces extremist groups that refuse to back down. Their attacks continue, testing the strength of his military and the will of his people. Abroad, he faces suspicion and hostility. France views him as a threat to its influence. Western powers paint him as a pawn of Russia. Regional blocs question his legitimacy, and history whispers a warning: leaders who challenge the global order rarely escape unscathed. Yet despite the dangers, something undeniable has changed. In Ouagadougou, young people wear t-shirts with his face. In Bamako, protesters chant his name. On social media, he is hailed as a lion of Africa, a continuation of Sankara's dream. For the first time in decades, millions of Africans feel a spark of hope that their continent may no longer bow to outsiders. But hope can easily turn into disappointment. If Traoré fails to deliver real change, the people who now cheer for him could one day turn away. The truth is, no one knows what the future holds for Ibrahim Traoré. He could be remembered as the man who brought dignity and independence back to his people. Or he could be remembered as yet another leader whose promises crumbled under the weight of reality. But whatever happens, one fact cannot be denied: he has already changed the conversation. Across Africa, young men and women now look to Burkina Faso and ask themselves, if a 34-year-old captain can defy the odds and challenge empires, why can't we? Burkina Faso's struggle is far from over, but in the eyes of its people, the fight is no longer one of despair. It is one of possibility. And at the heart of it all stands Ibrahim Traoré, a soldier, a leader, a symbol, loved by many, feared by others, but ignored by none. The story of Traoré is not just about Burkina Faso. It is about Africa itself, about the eternal question of freedom, power, and the destiny of a continent still searching for its true independence. You've been watching Citizens of Earth TV. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join our community of curious minds from around the world. See you in the next one.